Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I've posted over 100 excerpts from some of my more than 250 American montage shows that I did in the 1980s and 90s while at UPI Radio. Recently, I embarked on a fresh series of shows, and here's the second half of one of my new American Montage interviews. Welcome back. On this edition of American Montage, we're talking about a lot of things with Ed Walker, a veteran East Coast radio and TV personality born blind who conquered his handicap and went on to an incredible career, including working for decades with Willard Scott. On radio, he and Willard were the Joy Boys. And I asked Ed if they did their daily show, multi-hour program, much as Bob and Ray did, by pretty much making it up as they went along.
Well, that's what we did. We couldn't write that kind of material every day. Now, we had our little soap opera that we did for a while, As the Worm Turns, and Willard would write down names and the plot. He would read this week in Big City Hospital, Dr. So-and-so and so-and-so. And the first episode of As the Worm Turns involved the doctor who we made out to be a complete idiot. And the doctor was not Dr. Kaleo. We got that name because Willard saw a sign in a road in Virginia for a town called Callio. And so he just paraphrased it and said, Dr. Kaleo. And he was kind of a nudnik. And after the first episode, we get a call from NBC legal department. You got to knock that off. Change that doctor's name. His lawyer just called us.
Wow, so there was a real Dr. Kaleo somewhere?
This is true. He called he says, we have to ask you to take that doctor's name off the show. You're prejudicing our case. I said, what case? He says, Dr. Kaleo's up on a malpractice charge.
That kind of squashed the use of that character from episode 1, didn't it?
And there's more to it. About 5 years later, I've left WRC. I'm now at WMAL. We had an intern there, a young girl, and I can't think of her name. She says to me one day, Mr. Walker, my mother said to tell you hello. I said, well, I don't believe I know your mother. She said, well, she knows you. She was Dr. Kaleo's secretary.
Ed, one interesting aspect of your career, first of all, you had enormous success in radio, even though you're blind, is that you did television. I remember watching you on TV in D.C., and you're standing there looking right at the camera, supposedly looking right at the camera, and in your left hand is a clipboard, and you're reading Braille. I mean, it was the damnedest thing I've ever seen, but it worked.
Well, that's the station at first wouldn't show that clipboard. They would not show my hands. And, of course, I got directions by wearing an earpiece, interrupted feedback thing, and the director up in the control room would tell me which camera to look at. And that's how I did it. It was actually easier than radio because I didn't have to figure the times or anything like that. And if I had to talk up a piece of film, they'd count down. We get down to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hope that I got there in time, and then they'd roll the audio,
Wow, it sounds complicated, but as you say, it worked.
And that was very good. And then the station ultimately decided that was okay. Somebody called up the station one time and said, I had a question. A guy that does that television show in the morning, is he blind? And I said, yes, he is. And they said, well, I just wanted to know. I just was curious. I saw his hand reading Braille, and I just wondered. So they accepted it. It was, it wasn't a big deal.
Actually, what would have been funny is if the station would have told callers, no, Mr. Walker is not blind. He just likes to read books in Braille while he's on the air.
Yeah.
And let's talk about something near and dear to our hearts here, and that's the preservation of old-time radio. Now, there are those experts in film who say that less than half of the movies ever made still have a decent copy. Many from the silent era simply fell apart from that old nitrate film. There's not that much old-time radio still around. It's ironic that when all of that was being done live in the 20s and 30s and most of the 40s, they didn't think it was important to record. Of course, they didn't care much for the quality of recording. You would actually make a record. You would record a disc on a big bulky machine called a lathe cutter. But some of those shows, the only reason we have any copies of them at all is that the sponsors wanted a copy just to make sure the commercials went okay.
Well, that's probably true. And Vic and Sade was another show.
And thank God that Fibber McGee and Molly had that long association with Johnson's Wax. Johnson's Wax made a recording of every Fibber McGee and Molly show. They were almost thrown out. Some young person at the headquarters didn't realize who Fibber McGee and Molly were, but the only reason we have all of that wonderful wealth of Fibber McGee and Molly is because of the archivists at Johnson's Wax.
Yeah, and that's what happened to Vic and Sade. The sponsor wanted air checks as Procter & Gamble, and they were cleaning out their files one day, so we don't need all these big discs, and they got rid of them. So they're hard to come by. Some of them are being saved now because of Armed Forces Radio service.
Can you explain for those listening who do not know how important Armed Forces Radio was to preserving old-time radio shows? Can you explain how that happened and how we really owe them a debt?
Well, Armed Forces Radio service had the right to take shows off the network, cut out the commercials, and put in public service announcements that were played to the servicemen and women overseas, So they didn't have commercials, but they had the rest of the show was taken right off the air. And they were supposed to have been destroyed, but you know how people are in this business. They saved them. And so some of these shows are showing up from Armed Forces discs, and that's good. Now the collectors are digitizing them, which is helping a lot. They used to have them on tape, and you know how tapes get noisy after a while. But now with digital, they just can digitize everything. And so that really helps the fidelity. And there are a lot of things online. You can see different places that sell old time. There's one called Radio Archives. There's another one that supplies me with shows, and we give him a credit every week. It's called Old Time Radio on MP3.com.
And MP3, which is a type of compression of audio files, is amazing. I got a disc through the mail one time that had, I think, 60 hours. Maybe not quite that many, but 60 hours of old-time radio. Can you imagine that would have been 30 cassettes? And back in the days of disc, MP3 has opened up a huge opportunity to cram a lot of audio, particularly old-time radio, which doesn't have a lot of fidelity, to cram a lot of audio into a small space.
And depending upon the bit rate that they use, they don't sound half bad in MP3, no.
Now, Ed, on your radio show, which has run for decades in Washington, D.C., on the preeminent public radio station there in Washington, you do a weekend show that is a real play it again when it comes to old-time radio. I know you have a chance to sample the demographics. Is it mostly old guys like me who are listening to OTR, old-time radio, or is it a pretty good cross-section?
A lot of kids listen, and we are, not that there are too many people listening to the radio on Sunday night. Most people are watching 60 Minutes, but we are the number one show on radio, people listening to the radio at that time, which we've been doing that for a long time, and people just seem to like it. It's appointment listening, as they say at the station. It wouldn't go over every night, but at the end of the week, as I say at the beginning of every show, forget about the problems you'll face in the week to come, and any problems you had in the last week, forget them. This is our time of day, the end of one week, the beginning of another, and for 4 hours, you just revel in nostalgia, and that's what they did.
Ed, now, that salutation really smacks of old-time radio. Reminds me of that show called Moon River that was done out of Chicago. That is such a wonderful, restful, optimistic way to wrap up the week.
Yeah, it is.
Ed, in our minutes remaining, let's talk about the wonderful wealth of announcers who worked in the Washington area. On another one of these broadcast shows, I talked to Fred Fisk, who spent 60 years in radio in Washington. Not only was it the place where locally you had such wonderful news people from David Brinkley on down, local little-known people such as Bryson Rash, my childhood hero Edward P. Morgan. All of those people were there, but they had you and Willard and Fred Fisk and a ton of other people doing fun radio. And I remember listening to two guys, Hardin and Weaver. Now, Frank Hardin was an announcer on ABC also. He was Edward P. Morgan's announcer, and he did that memorable introduction, the 13.5 million members of the AFL-CIO who are working to keep America strong and free, bring you Edward P. Morgan and the news.
That's right, AFL-CIO, yes.
And his partner, Jackson Weaver, with a gorgeous baritone voice. I first knew him decades before I moved to D.C., much as I had heard you. He was the original voice of Smokey the Bear. Did you know those two guys?
I knew him, yes. Jackson has unfortunately passed away, but Frank is still going strong, and he's in his 80s now. And the last time I saw Frank was a Christmas party or something. I said, "How you doing, Frank?" He says, "Oh, I'm into ecology these days." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "This morning I took out the trash."
I love one-liners like that, and most people in radio are full of them.
That was a very popular team, Hardin and Weaver, who had the morning show. We never got to be on in the morning, and much to our chagrin. We were good friends with Hardin and Weaver, so we were friendly competitors.
And I think you and I should feel fortunate that we did radio back when it was fun, when you had a lot of people helping you. You went out and you did all kinds of exciting stuff. Now it is so cut and dried, so pared down to almost nothing. I talk to young people in radio today, and they say the only fun they have, and they dread coming to work most days, the only fun they have is when they go out and do a remote broadcast.
Yeah, I see. I never got to do a big band remote. Now, Willard did, and it's something I missed. They used to broadcast from the Spanish Ballroom at Glen Echo here, and they have big bands come there. I know Mac McGarry, a friend of mine, did the Dorseys and Ray Anthony, Les Elgart, and they had Willard come and show how music changed in the 50s. McGarry had done Tommy Dorsey. The next week, the featured artist was Bill Haley and the Comets.
Wow. You know, that change in radio from Glenn Miller and all the other big bands to rock and roll seemed to almost happen overnight.
It did. And Willard was the announcer, couldn't even get on the stage because of the crowd. He had to go back to the station and plug in the intros to the songs. He couldn't get to the stage.
Ed, I have worked in a lot of different parts of the U.S., but I wouldn't trade those 20 years I spent in Washington, D.C. for anything.
I've been lucky. My whole broadcasting career, I've worked in the city, which is, again, very unusual because most guys, when they start, they go to broadcasting school and you end up in Talladega, Alabama at a 250-watt station or something, and then you work your way up. But I was fortunate to get on a big station right off I had another station before that. There was a station called, what's still on, WPGC, and they had their studios and transmitter in Morningside, Maryland. It was a brand new station when I got there, and the owner of that station had a daughter that was mentally retarded or something, and so he took pity and gave me a job, not for pay. He bought me lunch every day first.
So in order to get your foot in the door, so to speak, as a young guy, you went way out in the country, in the far-flung Washington, D.C. suburbs to work for gratis, but you did get lunch.
It was a new station, didn't have any money, but I would travel all the way out to Morningside, Maryland, and do the show out there. And the transmitter we had the studios in the transmitter building, and it was on a guy's farm. And I had to sign off the station, and I had to record the sign-off because I couldn't get through it straight, because I would say, "Our studios, offices, and transmitter are located on the farm of Mr. Duval B. Evans." About that time, you'd hear a rooster crow off in the distance.
Reminds me of a station I worked at in Indiana where they had horses in the background.
And I just couldn't get through it. I had to record it some night when I knew the roosters were going to bed. But that was fun, too. That was a learning experience. They had no hot water in the building. The teletype machine was in the bathroom, and the guy who did the midday news would go in about 11. I'm going in to edit the news, and he knew what he was going to do in there.
But, Ed, because it is radio, because it is the sound of the human voice, you can really create something out of nothing. I mean, it is the theater of the mind.
Yeah.
Ed, let me give a little demonstration here, and this was widely used in the golden days of radio. I have a big sheet of cellophane here, very similar to what cigarette packages are wrapped in. And in the old days, they would crinkle it up, and you would add... And then over in the corner, you would have someone who was good at making the sound of a siren, maybe with their mouth, or a small siren machine, and people mulling around making crowd noise. And you could do wonderful things on radio. Let me put out this fire. Of course, you also had the people who could paint pictures with words. Edward R. Murrow, probably foremost among them. And you mentioned a restroom earlier. It's funny that first studio they gave Murrow in London was apparently originally a women's restroom.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Those were good days, for radio, too. Some of the stuff that Murrow did, if you ever have a chance to hear his description of Buchenwald, which is a concentration camp.
I cannot listen to that to this day or try to recite any part of it without getting out a box of Kleenex. It is that gut-wrenching, and it's all word pictures.
Oh, yes. Ed Murrow was probably one of the greatest newsmen I've ever heard, who didn't start out to be a radio newsman, actually. But anybody who listens to this and teaches or radio classes, I would urge them to have their students listen to some of those recordings.
Ed, speaking of Edward R. Murrow, did you get to see the movie Good Night and Good Luck, the story of Murrow in the McCarthy era that was, I think, done exceptionally well?
It was interesting. I have it around here. I know somebody told me that a lot of people smoked cigarettes in that movie.
Boy, you're not kidding. It was full of smoke-filled rooms and people with cigarettes.
And of course, Murrow was a chain smoker anyway.
And it ended up killing him.
Yeah, but the guy who did the part didn't even sound like Murrow, but he had the same phraseology. Whoever wrote the script knew some of Murrow's taglines that he would use. And the movie was interesting, and I think it was it educated some people who don't remember Murrow and Person to Person and those shows, See It Now, and those shows that they did in the 50s and 60s.
And as a kid, I never missed See It Now. My parents never missed that Murrow show on Sunday night. So years later, I go to college. They're showing the classic Merle McCarthy broadcast, and I can't figure out why I didn't see it on television. I read about it, I heard about it, I never saw it. Then I realized it was on my 7th birthday, and my dad had thrown a big surprise birthday party that night, so that's why I never saw that classic Murrow.
And you missed it.
But thank God for film, and now you can get all of that Murrow stuff on DVD, the classic shows he did, Harvest of Shame, about migrant farm workers, and all those wonderful See It Now broadcasts, and even Person to Person, which, as you know, he didn't like doing. Back to D.C. for a moment. One of the long-standing characters in D.C. was someone I know you heard often, and a guy who was everywhere in early television was Arthur Godfrey.
Oh, he wrote the book. His style of doing commercials, one I remember, he ran out of time. He says, I got a couple of sponsors that didn't get in. One is Smith Transfer and Storage. The other one is Chambers Funeral Home. Don't make a move without calling Smith's. And if you can't move, call Chambers. That's how he got both commercials in.
Ed Walker, in the few moments remaining, back to the Joy Boys for a second. I remember hearing this great story about you use Papa music, and for ad-libbing this commercial for this German restaurant in D.C., and you got a little carried away, and finally the sponsor said, hey, I like it that way. Keep getting carried away during the commercial.
Well, we did that. We didn't read the commercial. We just ad-libbed them. And we had German background music in there. And we'd say, the old Stein, where the highbrow meets the lowenbrow, stuff like that. And stuff like that, But we got a lot of, I guess they're gone now. That shows you what happens to our sponsors. Well, Godfrey, getting back to Godfrey, I met him one time, and it was in the latter years. He lost his radio show, and he was a rather bitter old man, unfortunately. And he came in to the station, and I had gone to great lengths to find some of his clips from the early morning radio show. And he heard them, and the mics weren't on, and we're on the air, and he says, why the hell did you use those? Those aren't my best stuff. And I was kind of chagrined. I thought they were, But then when the mic got on, how are you? It couldn't be nicer.
Well, you have to say one thing about Arthur Godfrey. He was I'm not going to say two-faced. He was just a complicated kind of guy.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the fun things you did during an earlier interview was to show how radio can paint a picture. And you pretended to walk across the room and come back but you didn't leave. All you did was turn your head away from the microphone. Can you do that again for us, just pretending that you're going to go across the room to get some of your book collection?
Yeah, let me show you some of these here. All right. Over here. I'll bring them back now. You can take a look at them.
Boy, that is amazing. Now, you kind of faded out more than you would have in a radio studio because it's a little esoteric here, but you're using a directional microphone, and in the old days they used those ribbon mics which picked up everything, but you didn't leave at all. You just turned your head. You did not leave.
No. And that's the thing about the radio actors. They could anticipate the sound effects, like when the Lone Ranger would get on his horse. You don't write into a script, when you jump on a horse, or when a guy gets shot, and he falls down, It's amazing. I mean, they were consummate actors. They worked hand in glove with the sound man, no question.
Ed, it's been a great hour here, and you and I have known each other for a very long time. It's been a thrill to talk to you again and talk about what we both love the most, old-time radio. Let me ask you this, though. What would you say to a person who wants to learn about OTR, old-time radio, and secondly, to some young person who decides that he or she wants radio as a career in these days when there isn't much radio anymore?
Well, collect the old show. I wouldn't recommend anybody going into to be on the air, quite honestly, unless you're going to be in sales or news. Now, if you're a journalism major and you can get a job doing radio news and then television news, that's where the money is. The anchors on the morning or the evening news on television, they pay pretty well. The journeyman announcers don't make that much, quite frankly.
And from what I have heard, they really never did.
They never did, no. And they don't have the luxury of picking their own music. The music is picked for you, and you press a button, and the computers play it, and you just read the music sheet. So it's not the fun that it used to be. I still love it, and I still enjoy listening to those old radio shows, and I just wish the times would come back when we could do that stuff again.
Ed Walker, one of the best-loved announcers on the East Coast, thanks again. This has been great fun.
You're more than welcome, Dennis, and I hope you do get back here sometime.
Veteran announcer Ed Walker, speaking to us from his home in suburban Washington, D.C. Some people may say Ed was born with a disadvantage. I simply say he was born with one heck of a lot of talent. I hope you enjoyed this interview from my new American Montage series. Check out YouTube for more. I'm Dennis Daly.